All right, we are speaking with Dr. John Harms and Renee Fry from the OpenSky Policy Institute. We're going to talk about taxes today a little bit, and also maybe what should happen in the next session that we're facing. And I guess, Renee, first of all, you guys are kind of concerned about the fact that we're facing this hole in the budget and what the legislature really is facing as far as trying to fix the revenue problem, right?
Yeah, we have a pretty significant budget situation that the legislature is going to have to deal with next session. We're hearing that it could be as big as $500 to $700 million that we're short in paying the bills. So that will make it pretty tough for legislators. There's going to be a lot of really difficult choices. Senator Harms knows how difficult these choices are better than anyone. He's been through this situation before, and it's going to be tough. Legislators are going to be deciding between funding K-12 education, university, health and human services. It's not going to be a fun session.
All right. Dr. Harms, you were a member of the Appropriations Committee over the last 8 years before John Stinner just took over, and he's there now. But you were, this happened while you were in your 8 years. How do you guys focus on what things need to be done?
Well, first of all, you have a couple of options. You can think through the process about, shall we just take 10% out of everybody's budget all the way across the board, or shall we just zero in on specific areas? And usually the first thing that comes up, which is an easy target, which I've always objected to, let's just hit education, because it's easy to get to. But it's probably one of the most important things we've got here. We're educating our kids. We're preparing them for the future. I always disagreed with that aspect of it. And then you get into health and human services, and then with all the problems health and human services had, didn't make them real popular. I'm not sure it still has. They still have a lot of things to try to address. So you look at health and human services, and I'll be very honest with you, when you sit for 7 or 8 hours in testimonies and listening to people talk, and the people come in and talk about the services that they need and the help they need. Nebraska's a poor state in many areas, and to start really zeroing in on some of the issues that people have is really a tragedy. So it is very difficult to do. You can look at trimming back, government, which we did. We looked at trying to trim back government. We looked at trying to, even some thoughts about going into the offices of the senators and eliminating some positions, at that time. It is really hard to decide and to stay focused on. Those are all hard decisions. I know when I used to come back to Western Nebraska and talk to to the people that I represented, and they started talking about tax cuts and what they wanted and what relief, I always said, you know what? Tell me what services you want to give up. Because that's what it boils down. What can you do without in this great state? And I'll carry that message back, and I'll do my darndest to help you achieve that goal. And all of a sudden, that starts backing people back to looking at, well, maybe I ought to rethink this. What services can I give up? And I think government is not too big in Nebraska. It's a one-house system. It's pretty lean the way it is. And they're pretty conservative. The beautiful thing about this thing is that we have to balance our budget every year. We can't borrow from one another, push it off. You got to balance it by the Constitution every year. And you make the hard decisions now. And that's what they're going to be confronted with. And I can tell you, when they shut that door in the Appropriations Committee, it's a battle.
So how did you do it when you were in there? Did you I think you guys kind of did something across the board a little bit, didn't you?
Yeah, well, I think we went across the board, but the other side of it is we got federal funds at that time. The federal government had given each of the states some money that you qualified for that helped us address that particular issue of cutting. So it wasn't that severe. And we had probably about $200 or $300 million in reserve, and I think they've got, or maybe just about $250 million in reserve. Now they've got a lot more in reserve, so they can ease some of those dollars with putting some of that money in reserve into the system. Okay, you have to be careful how far you go back, because if you put it into a system that's going to require those dollars to be returned every year, then you're in trouble. If it's a one-shot situation where it's an emergency for construction or whatever it might be, you can get by with that, as long as it doesn't commit you to a continuous funding process. So that's some of the things we tried to look at to use those dollars for. But if you get into reserves very far, you got to be really careful what you do, because it's going to come back and it will bite you.
Yeah. Okay. So, if, for example, we get the budget done, and I know there's a lot of talk about, okay, the tax system needs to get changed, property taxes are still the issue. Renee, your group is probably saying maybe we ought to hold off on that a little bit for at least a couple of years while we settle a revenue situation.
We need to address the revenue situation. Absolutely. In large part because one thing that we've really discovered is that when we have these tough budget years, we can have unintended consequences when we cut things. I haven't talked to Dr. Harms about this yet, but we were actually looking to see what was cut back during the last big budget cutting session. And we actually put some things in place. For example, in corrections, what we noticed, that's when the early release went into effect. So early release of inmates. And we know that that's created problems down the road. So we really need to be careful about those decisions and shore up our budget. Now, we've been advocating for a long time to really look at the way that we fund our schools. So we're second most reliant on property taxes to fund K-12 education. And as Senator Harms said, every year when we get in this budget year, the easiest thing to cut is education. And as he said, we couldn't agree more. Education is the most important investment we can make as a state. And so, unfortunately, it's just easy to keep pushing that back to the local level. And what we've seen in K-12, spending as a share of the economy has been flat. So K-12 spending is not out of control at all, even though sometimes you hear that. But what's happened is that we've cut state spending on K-12. We've pushed more and more of that back on the local level. We really need to step back and figure out a better system for funding K-12 education. The problem is, as Senator Harms knows, it's really difficult to do that when you have all of these other fires to deal with. Really hard to do that in a budget year, really hard to do that in a legislative session. We've really been advocating for a special separate committee to look at how we fund K-12 education. But until we do that, I think we're going to continue to have concerns about property taxes in Nebraska.
All right. So, Senator Harms, how do we get our state support up to the level where at least we're in the median part and not in the lower part as far as state support of K through 12
Well, I think
education?
You're going to have to decide whether or not you want to increase maybe sales tax or whatever it might be. You're going to have to increase something in order to accomplish that task, or you're going to have to cut pretty deeply in another area. And one of the things I want to just point out here, that when you look at rural America, rural Nebraska, which I have looked at a lot of the schools out here, they are really struggling. They're not getting the funding they need to have. Their facilities need to be brought up to date. And not only that, I think the real question in the future is going to be, how do we provide equal access to quality education? Because there is a decline in the number of children coming into the public school marketplace in rural Nebraska, and we're going to have to figure out, how do we handle this issue? What kind of educational system can we have? And how can we provide, appropriate educational structure that will educate kids to their fullest capabilities? And here's another interesting thing. You hear a lot of people say, well, we can use technology, John. Well, what about a child who has special needs? What about a child who's 150 miles or 100 miles away from the nearest school? If we start consolidating, how are we going to get that child there? How do we provide that kind of service? And that's what you get into. Nebraska is a big place to live. When you get out here in rural Nebraska, there's a lot of space. But I just want to, I've always felt, I guess, that we really need to start to address that issue. What kind of educational system do we want? Because it's knocking on our door, and it will be here in the next 10 years.
Okay. All right. So maybe we can address that. The other thing I guess you guys are talking about, Renee, is that we need to look at our Nebraska Advantage Act a little bit and maybe assess where it's working and where it's not, right?
Yeah, actually, Dr. Harms put a study in motion before he left, where we were looking at our tax incentive programs and really did a great job in making that a priority, where we actually look at our tax incentive programs every 3 years to see if they're meeting the goals that we hope that they meet. And I think one thing that has come up most recently is that our tax incentive programs probably are not creating high quality jobs that we want to in areas that we want to. The governor had SRI do a report. They really encouraged the state to be looking at focusing on creating high quality, high paying jobs. We had a speaker come in, Dr. Timothy Bartek, who said the same thing. There is a place for tax incentives. They should be very, very targeted, and they should be very focused on creating high-paying jobs. And so I think as a state, we all want to live and thrive in communities, and high-paying jobs are an important piece of that. The SRI report that the governor had done also found that our wages in Nebraska are below average. So I think that really reinforces that we need to look at creating high-paying jobs rather than creating jobs for the sake of creating jobs.
Yeah, and that's occurred in, even when you look at LB 840, it's occurred on jobs around here where the pay is maybe a little above minimum wage, and yet the company gets tax credits for that, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. And the other side of it is, I think, I'm going to go back to this educational side of things. I think that Nebraska has to decide what kind of a structure it wants to have as far as businesses and manufacturing firms. And when they do that, then we have to make sure that we prepare the workers to be able to go into those positions. That's part of the problem we have here. We're overeducating people with bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and doctor's degrees, and there's no jobs for these young people, so they're leaving the state. And what we're short in this great state and this great nation is a simple fact: we don't have skilled workers. And I'll tell you what, you could be a welder and make a phenomenal amount of money compared to being someone who has a bachelor's degree in another field. And I think that's really important for us. We have to decide, I always have said, you have to decide what we want to be when we grow up. So what is it you want to focus on here? What is the kind of jobs you want to have? And then let's gear our educational system up, and let's become competitive, drop the fence down, and let's go after it.
Yeah. So you as a community college president, you should know we have a welding program here, very successful.
Yep.
Maybe people ought to seriously think about that before they start jumping into getting just a bachelor's in business, right?
Well, yeah, welding, automotive technology, diesel technology, just any field in the area of technology. Allied health is a great field to go into, from nurses to any kind of technician. And rural America is really short of people in these particular areas. And you can get a good job, well-paying job, and take care of your family really well if you go into some of these different fields. And so a lot of parents need to rethink about their children. Everybody thinks they got to have the bachelor's degree, you got to have the master's degree. You really don't. You can do really well just becoming certified in specific areas or getting an associate's degree in some area.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually it's interesting. If you look at business surveys, UNL does a regular business survey. Workforce is number one concern and has been for several years. Not taxes. Taxes end up about fifth in that in terms of priorities. But workforce is the number one issue for employers today and has been for a while. So I think it's absolutely time for us to have a conversation about creating high-wage, high-skilled jobs, about making sure that our workforce is meeting the needs of our businesses and meeting the needs in our communities and helping us to create thriving communities in Nebraska.
Okay. All right. Anything else we want to talk about? Is that it?
I just would say this. I think I've been with OpenSky for now 3 years. I tell you what, I would just say to anyone who's listening, OpenSky is a phenomenal think tank, and Renee is very bright, and she has very bright researchers working for her. And when I was in the legislature, outside of the information we would get from our own appropriations fiscal staff, her information was the only one I trusted. And we checked it out, and I became a fan of OpenSky because they do good raw research. They lay it out for the public, and they don't twist it or turn it. You can design research to get an answer that you want. They just lay it out and say, okay, if you go this direction, here are the results. good or bad, folks, here they are. And if they're bad, you ought to rethink this. So I would just tell people to really pay a lot of attention to what OpenSky Institute does and what Renee is saying, because she's very accurate, very good, and I'll tell you, I'm proud to be a part of that organization.
All right. Very good. Thanks.
Nope.
That's a pretty good
endorsement.
pretty good
Hey,
endorsement
We're
there.
lucky to have them.
Yeah, yeah. All
I'll
right.
take a $10 raise.
All right.
All
Thanks.
right. Thank you.
Thank you.